Okay, hi everyone. Let's do a very quick recap what we have learned in the last 2 weeks. Remember, we talked about the prisoner's dilemma and mechanisms for sustaining corporations in the prisoner's dilemma. And we also learned about both simultaneous move and sequential form sort of games, sequential move games in game theory. And you learned how to solve sequential form games for the sub-game perfect Nash equilibrium using backward induction. And we also learned that sometimes sequence matters. So being able to go first may help solving coordination problems. Sometimes there's an advantage for the first mover. Sometimes there's a second mover advantage where you're better off if you can observe what the first mover does. But there were also some questions. So somebody asked about tic-tac-toe and chess. So the question is, can we draw a game tree like the ones we drew in the sequential move games for other games, actual games like tic-tac-toe? And the answer is yes. And I think if you Google it, you'll find examples of the game tree for tic-tac-toe actually being drawn out. It's really large, but we all know that in tic-tac-toe, if you don't make a mistake, you can't really lose, right? So people have sort of internalized the mechanism for how to win in this game. What about chess? Chess is a game where there's no randomness, there's no chance involved in what happens. So it should be perfectly possible to sort of use backward induction and strategic forward thinking in chess. And the answer is not quite. So of course, chess players use strategic thinking and think of many moves, in some cases ahead, in terms of sort of what they want to do. But writing down the game tree for the whole game is impossible because of the sort of the combinatorial explosion. There are so many possible moves, so many possible pieces, so many possible moves. And I think some people have tried to estimate this, and they came up with an estimate of this number of possible moves in the chess game, which you would need to use backward induction, right? And that is something like 10 to the power of 123, which is more than the number of atoms in the observable universe. So it's an incredibly large number because it is, because for every move there's many further moves that are then possible based on this one. So it's a huge huge number, of course. And as a consequence, it is not possible to solve a game like chess from the end using backward induction. So we have to use other things. We have to use algorithms to play well. And we've already encountered one algorithm that maybe helps sometimes to play well. And I think I said it in one of the seminars. And that is basically something like tit for tat. So start out playing nice, and then reciprocate what the other person does. That's probably a good strategy for playing Prisoner's Dilemma, corporation type games. Maybe it's not a bad strategy for life. But for chess and for other things, you need, of course, algorithms. For example, algorithms that weight the value of different pieces or the value of different positions on the board, of course. So other algorithms. What about games like poker or other games where there's either randomness involved or things like incomplete information where you don't know what the other player has in terms of the cards, or where you have beliefs about what the other player might have. And mixed strategies, these kind of things. And this is where it gets a bit more complicated, of course. And we'll skip most of these for now, just because the work is a little more involved in order to solve these, and they aren't that interesting for some of the problems that we have. So we are moving on now to social choice type problems. Now I'll explain what that is on the next slide. Okay, so what is social choice? Social choice is this weird term given to basically theoretical approaches to group decision making. So taken together as a group, small group even, how can we make choices together? How do we aggregate under our individual sort of preferences, our individual wishes and desires and and preferences over outcomes, for example. How do we aggregate those and make decisions as a group? And as you know, one of the easiest things people will say, well, we vote. Okay, well, voting is complicated because there are many voting methods. So the most common one perhaps is sort of majority rule, right? So whichever option gets a majority is chosen. And this is how we make many decisions. But there are many other mechanisms for how to count what the majority is, for example. People have heard maybe about border count, or things like approval voting or majority runoff, if you think about sort of presidential elections in France, perhaps, or the alternative vote if you're in the UK, or single transferable vote if you're from Ireland or Australia, which are more complicated ways to aggregate people's preferences and give them more choice, maybe. Or things like proportional representation, of course, versus majoritarian or single-member district plurality systems for electing sort of legislative bodies, parliaments. So many voting methods exist. But what we will learn is that there are problems with those voting methods. And one of the things we'll encounter early on is Condorcet's paradox, which basically says that even if we're individually rational, as a group, we can be irrational. So we need to clarify a little bit what rationality actually means, and we'll do that on the next slide. But basically, what we'll learn is that all these voting methods are fundamentally flawed. There are paradoxes and problems and the potential for manipulation in all of them. And we'll encounter briefly sort of what's called Arrow's impossibility theorem and the Gibbard-Satterthwaite theorem that clarify those problems. But of course, we shouldn't give up. In the end, we have to make decisions, but we have to be aware of how these electoral systems or voting methods, how they affect the outcome, how they structure our decision making, and how they affect what we get in the end. And that's one of the key points also I would like you to sort of take away from this, perhaps, is that these institutions, they really matter. The rules of the game that we play really matter, and we may completely determine the outcome in some circumstances, given the choice of institutions. So the choice of institutions is perhaps the real choice. Another key takeaway point perhaps is that group decision making is really tricky. So it's not straightforward. And like I said, all voting rules are flawed and open to manipulation. And we'll also perhaps learn that there's always a bigger game. So even if we write on the game that we face and have all sort of figured out what the choices are, then we will see that perhaps sometimes the choice of the institutions or some choice outside of the game is what happens as a consequence. And next week we will talk about spatial models of politics. So lots of you are familiar with sort of left-right ideas, and we'll clarify a lot of that next week. So let's get started with one of these paradoxes, Condorcet's paradox. So what is Condorcet's paradox? Well, so this guy is the Marquis de Condorcet, and he is what we would today call a social scientist, an 18th century social scientist. And he was one of the first people to sort of apply what was then known about mathematics to problems like voting and choosing in groups and decision making. And he put some of these ideas into practice by, during the French Revolution, becoming a member of the Assemblée Nationale, and he had grand ideas about, liberal ideas about egalitarianism. He was an early abolitionist against slavery, and also for women's rights and women's suffrage in 1790, no less. It took a while for that to get passed, didn't it? And he also proposed education reforms, education being an important policy field, of course, that actually got instituted. But like so many people during the French Revolution, he, of course, in the end fell foul of the Robespierre and his gang, and was branded a traitor, and he went into hiding, but was captured in the end and died in prison in 1794. But before all of this, his sort of short political career during the revolution, he wrote on this problem that we're facing here: voting and decision-making groups. And he was the first to think about what does a group of people that has to choose among three outcomes, what does this look like? So he encountered this paradox that we'll encounter as well, that basically if you think about individual preference orderings, if we list them all, so I can prefer A over B over C, or you can prefer B over A over C, or C over B over A. So there are basically six sort of possible rankings, but there are two degenerate ones that are sort of these cycles that they will encounter. And he encountered this very problem, and he wrote clearly, if anyone's vote was self-contradictory, it would have to be discounted. We should therefore establish a form of voting to make such absurdities impossible. So there's still some optimism that it can be solved, but it's not. But basically, the key takeaway point, the key problem of the Condorcet paradox is that even if we are individually rational, we may not act rationally as a group. So we may end up being irrational as a group. So we have to think about what means rational or irrational, and we have all sorts of ideas in our heads, maybe about people being like Mr. Spock. But we have a very, very simple definition here. So rationality for us just means that people have a complete and transitive preference ordering over outcomes. And we can write this down like this with this sort of preferred X preferred to Y sign. And basically, rationality requires completeness and transitivity. So complete preference ordering just means that if I have some options, X and Y, I either prefer X to Y, or I prefer Y to X, or I'm indifferent between them. Basically, I can, if you present me with a list of options, I can, about all of these, tell you which one I like better, which one I like worse, or the ones that I like the same. Transitivity is maybe a little more complicated. It's a fancy word, but doesn't mean that much. It just means that if I prefer X over Y and I prefer Y over Z, then I must also prefer X over Z. Else you could, you could sell me one thing for the next thing and keep me sort of in a cycle of losing money. Huh? But maybe it's not completely clear. So let's see a simple example. The best way to illustrate rationality is using chocolate bars. So completeness just means that if you offer me Snickers, Twix, and Mars, I have some sort of idea of how I like these. I can say I like them all the same, or I don't like any of them, I say I like Snickers better than Twix, better than Mars, or something like that. But basically, I have to have an opinion on these options. But the opinion can be all the same. Okay, that's completeness. What about transitivity? Well, transitivity means that if I prefer Snickers over Twix, which happens to be the case, and I prefer Twix over Mars bars, then I must also like Snickers better than Mars bars. Everything else is crazy. It would be what is called an intransitivity, or violation of the transitive preference ordering. I wouldn't be able to make a decision, or you could sort of offer me things in turn, and I would always say, yes, I like this better. It's crazy. So it would be irrational. And this is exactly the way Condorcet thought about this. Well, not with Snickers bars, obviously, but sort of with three options, A, B, C, and what happens. But the kicker is this. Condorcet's paradox says that even if we individually are all rational, we all have normal sort of preference orderings. We like Snickers better than Twix, better than Mars, or maybe Twix better than Mars, better than Snickers, or Mars better than Snickers, better than Twix, whatever it is, but no cycles. Even if we are all individually rational, we can end up in a situation where, as a group, when we try to make a decision, we get into this crazy situation that we choose Snickers over Twix, and then we choose Twix over Mars, and then we choose Mars over Snickers. It's crazy, okay? And some of you will say, well, what is this? This is some weird fabricated example. Well, we all got to see it in action when we watched the Brexit votes, the indicative votes, and the sort of the stalemate around Theresa May's deal and the sort of Brexit outcome maybe about 2 years ago. So let's look at that in a little more detail. Basically, this impasse was sort of around so 2018, 2019, it was around sort of the problem of like, what kind of Brexit should happen, or should Brexit happen at all? And I remember Theresa May then negotiated sort of her deal, the withdrawal agreement, and that was one option. Then there was a no deal option, obviously, and there was also a faction in Parliament, of course, that wanted either softer Brexit, so staying in the single market, for example, and some wanted a referendum or rejoining the EU, not leaving, remaining in the EU. And so there were all these different options. But basically, the problem was that there was no majority for any of these options. And there was this idea of indicative votes. And these indicative votes were basically an attempt to solve this impasse, to get out of this sort of stalemate, this dead end, and trying to find a solution that could not command a consensus, but command at least a majority of support. But none was found. So there was the idea of a confirmatory referendum. There was the idea of no deal, of course, for the ERG. There was a Labour plan, a Ken Clarke plan, an EFTA option, staying in the single market. So lots of options, but none of these options actually was able to get to a majority. So let's look at what this looks like in a slightly simplified version. And I've tried to sort of to narrow down the options a little bit and sort of try to stay within the realism of the rough size of these groups, perhaps, but to also create an illustrative example. So it may not be 100% what happened back then, but back then there were more options and more factions, basically, and it was very hard to figure out what exactly those factions were. But so for simplicity's sake, let's say in Parliament there were about 48% Remainers at the time. Remember, this is before the 2019 election. So 48% of Remainers, and perhaps their preference ordering looks something like this. So they would prefer to remain in the EU over a soft Brexit, over a hard Brexit, something like no deal, or the scenario that we're facing now. What about Leavers? So then there was another group, Leavers, sort of moderate Leavers perhaps, who would have preferred a soft Brexit over a hard Brexit, so respecting the referendum result over staying in the EU. Maybe that's another 30%. And then you have a third group, perhaps sort of the ultras, the ERG. So these people want the hard Brexit, the no deal kind of option. But perhaps they are a bit strategic and say, like, well, the soft Brexit is kind of the worst outcome. Staying in the single market, keeping everything, but no ability to make the rules and no ability to bash the EU anymore. So maybe they were a bit strategic. So maybe their preferences were such that they would prefer hard Brexit over actually staying in the EU and fighting another day over sort of single market soft Brexit. And not no deal is better than a bad deal or something was their slogan, wasn't it? So about 20%, say. So 52% for Leave, 48% for Remain. That sounds familiar. So what did this look like in Parliament? So Parliament in the UK and everywhere else really uses majority rule, of course. So if everyone is present, is there any option that can command an absolute majority? So what was the outcome of this? Of course, no winner. We know this. Theresa May's deal failed. Other proposals failed as well. So there was no winner. What alternative voting methods could have been used to perhaps identify a viable option? Well, one thing that sometimes comes up is round robin kind of tournaments. So if there's no alternative that commands a majority right away, perhaps there's an option that beats all other alternatives in a sort of pairwise contests. what is called a Condorcet winner, and this is called the Condorcet method after Condorcet. Perhaps there would have been one option that beats all the other options. And that was partly the intent behind creating all these different proposals for these indicative vote. Perhaps we can identify an option that is preferred by a majority to all others. But what would the outcome of this be in this scenario? Well, if there are these three options, what happens? Well, if we pit sort of Remain versus soft Brexit, we would get 68% support for Remain in this scenario, right? If we take the preference orderings above. If we pit soft Brexit versus hard Brexit, we would have soft Brexit winning, and if we have hard Brexit versus EU membership, a hard Brexit would prevail. So, of course, there is no Condorcet winner in this scenario that beats all other alternatives in the pairwise contest. But this is a clever alternative voting system that can solve these problems in some cases. And the impetus behind the indicative votes was clearly to search for a Condorcet winner that could unite Parliament in terms of a majority behind an option. But what's peculiar about this outcome? Well, we know that as a group, Parliament preferred perhaps Remain over soft Brexit, so voted down the soft Brexit option with 68%. So this is Remainers and the ultras voting for Remain in this case. Parliament then defeated the hard Brexit option, said no, we don't want no deal. So they would prefer perhaps soft Brexit over hard Brexit. This is the Leavers and the Remainers voting together. It's 80%. But they also voted against EU membership, of course, and so hard Brexit won against EU membership with the support of the Leavers and the ultras. But of course, this is the violation of transitivity that we talked about before. So individually, all of these three groups, Remainers, Leavers, and ultras, have perfectly normal sort of rational preference orderings. It's not wrong to say like you prefer EU over soft over hard, or soft over hard EU, or hard over EU over soft. These are possible preference orderings, and there were many more given that there were many other options. So individually, these people are not crazy, but taken as a group, we are irrational. It is impossible to make a decision. We end up in this kind of situation. So rational individuals, but irrational as a group, exactly as the Condorcet paradox predicts. So what's the consequence of using majority rule here? Or doing contests between these different options? Well, basically we end up with cyclical majorities. So there would be a majority for hard Brexit that gets then beaten by some soft Brexit option that then gets beaten by Remain, that then gets beaten by hard Brexit again. So we would sort of cycle through different scenarios. And in practice, people of course know this, and then there's indecision. There's no decision can be made, and that's exactly the scenario we saw in 2018, 2019 of a sort of stalemate, an impasse that could not be resolved within Parliament. Okay, so one objection might be, okay, so how common is this problem actually? Well, it doesn't happen every day, of course, and often we are confronted with a situation where there's a majority for a certain option. But basically, the more voters there are and the more options they are voting on, even if they have rational preference ordering, the more common these scenarios appear, this group level irrationality appears. So the more voters and the more alternatives they vote on, the more frequent are those violations of transitivity and those cycles and the indecision that comes with it. But of course, in practice, we have these problems have to be solved somehow. So how does it get solved in practice? There are basically two types of solutions we'll encounter today. So the next thing we'll talk about is agenda setting. So in practice, parliaments especially British Parliament, Congress, any parliament in the world, uses a lot of sort of tools that are related to agenda setting, where basically the sequence of votes or the types of the structure of how amendments can be made affect the outcome. And we'll talk about agenda setting next. The other solution, in a way, is sort of forcing restrictions on preferences. This is not something you can do with actual people, of course. We can't tell people what to vote for, MPs what to vote for. We can't say, well, you prefer this option over the other, so please now prefer this other option. So no, I mean, you can't do this in practice. But sort of empirically, if we think as social scientists, of course, many preferences sort of are correlated or fall into some dimension. And we all think about sort of politics in terms of left-right dimension, or in terms of sort of a left-right economic dimension and an authoritarian sort of liberal dimension, perhaps, but there can be others. So in practice, and the preferences are usually correlated. People who are for LGBT rights are also for women's rights, are also for other things, and people who are against government intervention into markets and sort of free market adherence, they probably also like lower taxes, and if they like high taxes, maybe they also more for interventions. So preferences in practice may be correlated, and that's what we talk about next week. How did it get resolved for in 2018, 2019? Well, we all know we ended up with sort of a hard Brexit, but an agreement. But of course, the resolution came without Theresa May, so it finished the government. So this indecision, this impasse, basically led to one of the parties triggering a leadership contest, and Boris Johnson, of course, becoming prime minister. Now, whether partly the impasse was, of course, in the strategic interest of some of the players is the second question. And this is where the key point from earlier comes in. There's always a bigger game. We modeled the game. We thought about the cyclical majorities, what people's preferences are. But the resolution could be outside of the game. The resolution was not found in Parliament, but it was found via a new election, right? But also some of these preferences may not be what they seem. So they may not be true preferences, but they were informed by the idea of creating the impasse, which then led to the downfall of Theresa May and the rise to power of Boris Johnson. So there's always a bigger game. But before we talk about agenda setting, we have a little exercise. So I want you to soon pause the video, go to Moodle, and click on homework number 1, the guessing game. So we are playing a guessing game. What are we guessing? Well, the rules are as follows. Everybody will submit a number between 0 and 100 inclusive. And we'll have a winner, and the winner is going to be the person who submits the number that is closest to 2/3 of the average of all the numbers submitted. And I want you to submit your guess for this number before Friday 9 a.m. so that we can look at it in the seminar, and I will announce the winner in the seminar. Good luck.